This is our Science Lectures 256. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us on our social media handles. That is at Science Lectures 256 on X and at Science Lectures 256 on WhatsApp. So today we are continuing with the discipline of developmental studies. Earlier we saw what developmental studies is as a combination of multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and anthropological history. We also saw the various terms that are used in this discipline. If you've not yet watched those videos, please do so. So today we are going to encounter a new concept of how did we get to the developmental studies we have today. Very important to note that this field is a new field. It is a new field. It is a new field. However, before we look at even the evolution of the discipline, it is very important to know that man has always had a grapple of what development is, of what constitutes a good life. So, development, as you saw earlier, can be defined using various things. But very important to note that the discipline of developmental studies is a new field that emerged after the end of the Second World War. The end of the Second World War. So, the Second World War was very, very important, and it provided a framework of development, especially within the African countries. Very important to note that the Second World War ended in 1945. But how did it end? Remember, around at the start of 1945, Japan bombarded America at the Pearl Harbor. So, in response to that, President Harry Truman ordered for the bombing of using nuclear bombs onto Japanese cities, that is Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the same time, also, Hitler and his men, the Nazis, invaded Russia in what is famously known as the Battle of Stalingrad. However, the Russians were able to defend themselves and emerged victors. So, you can see that at the end of the World War, we had new superpowers. That was the United Soviet Socialist Republic, which is USSR, which was also known as the Soviet Union. At the same time, we also had the USA. And that is the time when we ended Pax Britannica, and it saw the advent of Pax Americana. What do I mean by Pax Britannica, Pax Americana? So in international relationships, or what they call diplomacy, or what they call cultural studies, there is what we call the hegemonic stability theory, that since time immemorial, this world has had one superpower. So by the time we entered the Second World War, the superpower was Britain, and so we were in the reign of Pax Britannica. However, by the time the war ended, Britain had lost a lot of resources, and America had amassed a lot of wealth from selling of weapons. So it amassed a lot of gold because there was no standard international currency reserve, and that is how, in fact, those are one of the factors that saw the dollar become the international currency reserve. But that will be a story for another day. So, but America had amassed a lot of gold, and it had amassed a lot of wealth since it was not directly involved in the war. So, but however, very important note, in 1941, there was a meeting between us, the wartime Prime Minister of England, that was Winston Churchill, who famously named Uganda the Pearl of Africa, and the American President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was at the time in his fourth term as the American president. So they met and had a discussion, and that discussion ended up in what they call the Atlantic Charter of 1941. However, this document was unofficial. That is why even after their discussion, it wasn't sent to the British House of Commons, which is the British Parliament, and the Congress of America, because it was an informal agreement. However, by the time the war ended in 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had died, and his successor, who was his vice president at the time, Harry Truman, continued to carry on the accords of the Atlantic Charter, and one of them was to give the colonies their own independence. Give the colonies their own independence. Grant the colonies their own independence. In fact, in order to pursue the accords of the Atlantic Charter, America, since it was very rich, and these countries that had won, yes, they had won, but they had what we call Pyrrhic victory. Victory, but that came with a huge loss. So they needed resources. So President Harry Truman said it very well that if you want my resources, you must grant most of the African countries their independence. So when we were granted our independence, it saw development. It led to a lot of development. How? Number one, colonialism was characterized by a lot of exploitation. They come under the umbrella that we are constructing a road. Actually, the road was supposed to connect to a certain item. Let's say it is gold, and the gold was always taken out for export. If it is cash crops, the cash crops were taken out for what? Export, to supply their industries. So when we were granted our independence, most of those commodities were retained back at home, and they were used to develop the nation. Then number two, their independence saw the export of labor. Yeah, by the time the war ended, a lot of Africans had amassed a lot of knowledge, and that knowledge was later used at home without any cost. Yet initially, most of the expatriate labor was brought into the country, and they were very expensive in order to provide their services. But when African countries got their independence, export of labor stopped and import of labor stopped, because they had the skills that were necessary for provision of services. So that is number one of how the discipline of developmental studies came about. Then number two, in 1945, after the World War ended, there was formation of the UNO, United Nations Organization. However, the UNO was later replaced by United Nations. So it was replacing the League of Nations. Very important was that during the formation of the League of Nations, it was formed after the First World War. One of the major objectives was to prevent any other world war. But by the time the Second World War ended, the League of Nations had failed its objectives. So that is how they formed the United Nations Organization. And the United Nations Organization came up with other sister organs like IMF, which is International Monetary Fund. Things like UNDP, the United Nations Development Bank. Things like WTO, the World Trade Organization. So these three organs were very, very important in defining the framework of development. They gave out a lot of loans, especially to countries in the south. When I talk of the south, I know you know what I mean. So they gave out a lot of loans to countries in the south that were very vital for development. On top of that, they came up with various programs that would define and would see the development of African nations. Later we shall be discussing about the structural adjustment programs by the IMF. So that is another field to explain the development of the discipline of developmental studies. Then, after the end of the Second World War, yes, another war merged, which was called the Cold War. So what was the Cold War? The Cold War was a war between the US and its allies and Soviet Union, which was known as the United Soviet Socialist Republic, and its allies. So the US was leading the Western Bloc and Soviet Union was leading the Eastern Bloc. So the dichotomy between the two was about the differences in ideology. So the US believed in liberalism, and capitalism. So then members of the Soviet Union and other members believed in socialism. However, later people like Chairman Mao Zedong tried to modify socialism and came up with what they call communism. communism. And countries later like North Korea also modified socialism to come up with their own system. But how was this important in development? So in order to fight for allies, a lot of money was invested in research. If I forget, the Cold War had no an actual battlefield. They always had what they call proxy wars. For example, in South Africa, the US and its allies were already supporting the whites, while Soviet Union and its allies were already supporting Mandela and his colleagues. When they went to Angola, they were supporting the people that were fighting for independence. They supported Mugabe in Zimbabwe and the likes. Very important note, it had no actual battleground, but it was characterized by proxy wars. But we're still talking about research. So this research was, a lot of that research was done, and this research was very vital for development. So during this period, there was a lot of investment in research to find better products, improvement in technology, because both masters were competing for allies, and whoever would present the best would have more allies. So that is the effect of the Cold War on the development of the discipline of developmental studies. Then, later, around 1971, the United Nations came up with what they called the decade of economic growth. The decade of economic growth. The decade of economic growth. Decade of economic growth. So what was the decade of economic growth? It was a stipulated time of 10 years, and within those 10 years there were specified objectives that every country under the umbrella of the United Nations had to achieve. So it started from 1971, 1980, then you had another from 1981 to 1990, another from 1991 to 2000. So these were all periods of decades of economic growth. Then from 2000 to 2015, the United Nations came up with what they call the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. Then, after making an assumption that the Millennium Development Goals that we shall be discussing later were achieved, from 2016 to 2030, now the UN is under the program of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. So we are trying to see, after having achieved a lot in the decade of economic growth and the Millennium Development Goals, how can we sustainably keep those achievements? But this decade of economic growth, a lot of loans were given out, a lot of research was done, a lot of innovations were done because people had become virtuous. So this period was characterized by an increase in the gross domestic product and the gross national product. This shall later be discussed under measurements of growth, of development and economic growth. So during these periods, there was an increase in gross domestic product and gross national product. However, even after these things had increased, there was an observation that people were still poor, poverty was on an increase, there was a lot of unemployment, and there was a lot of income inequalities. When I talk of income inequalities, I mean that the rich were very rich, the poor were very poor. There was clear dichotomy between the rich and the poor. So, after having observed some of these, they say development can not only be measured using gross domestic product and gross national product. We need to set other litmus to tell us of what development is. That is why if you observe that in most of the developmental reports that have been published of recent, there are various measures that are put into place to define the development. Just a summary of what we discussed. The discipline of developmental studies evolved after the Second World War. Second World War saw the granting of independence. Then later there was the Cold War, which was characterized by a lot of research. The emergence of the UN and its sister organs. Then also the decade of economic growth. However, the discipline of developmental studies is relatively a new field, and it is still evolving. It is still developing, and Never know the next 10 years, the way we define development might have changed. But of today, that is where we stand. Till next time.